Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us this afternoon. For now, I'm going to hand over to Abdullah from the Abidjan Convention, who will be giving a brief recap for us today.
Thank you, Tara. Merci, Tara. Merci à nos partenaires de SST, Sustainable Seas Trust. Mesdames et messieurs, bonjour et bienvenue à cette nouvelle session de la série de webinaires de la Convention d'Abidjan pour doter la région d'un cadre légal de lutte contre la pollution plastique. Je rappelle que ce processus entre dans le cadre d'un programme financé par l'Union européenne et le programme des Nations Unies pour l'environnement qui s'appelle ACP MEAs 3, donc la phase 3 du programme de renforcement des capacités des pays Afrique, Caraïbes et Pacifique pour les accords multilatéraux sur l'environnement. Je rappelle qu'à la fin du processus, nous allons devoir accompagner les pays pour se doter de plans d'action nationaux de lutte contre la pollution plastique. Nous conduisons tout ce programme-là avec un certain nombre de panels, de partenaires qui viennent d'un peu partout, que ce soit les conventions Bâle, Rotterdam et Stockholm, que ce soit Tara Fondation et bien d'autres encore. Et je m'en veux d'avoir commencé à les énumérer parce qu'il y en a, ils sont nombreux. La semaine dernière, nous avons eu, disons que depuis le début, nous avons eu un certain nombre de présentations qui ont déjà bien calé le sujet, qui ont relevé tous les défis auxquels nous faisons face, que ce soit en matière de connexion entre les secteurs privés, les gouvernements locaux, les puissances publiques et le secteur de la recherche aussi. Et la semaine dernière ou la dernière session, nous avons eu Telly de l'Association des gouvernements locaux d'Afrique du Sud qui nous a fait une brillante présentation sur la façon dont les gouvernements locaux, les municipalités, disons, comme on le dit dans notre région, ou en français, les municipalités ou les communautés d'agglomération ou les régions, les structures décentralisées, font face à ce défi de la pollution plastique ou de la gestion des déchets. Nous avons vu comment il était difficile d'abord de collecter les taxes et les impôts qui doivent financer ces services de gestion des déchets. Nous avons vu aussi les difficultés auxquelles les gouvernements locaux faisaient face, surtout en matière de mobilisation des ressources humaines et de l'infrastructure, parce que ça demande de l'argent pour financer tout cela. Aujourd'hui, nous recevons Prabhat qui va être présenté tout à l'heure par Tony Ribink, mais j'aimerais dire un mot sur cet invité que nous avons aujourd'hui, qui est un partenaire capital pour la Convention d'Abidjan. Moi, Prabhat, j'ai fait sa connaissance il y a 2 ans quand nous avions été invités en Afrique du Sud par le WWF pour quand ils présentaient le rapport qu'ils avaient élaboré sur la pollution plastique dans la région de la Convention d'Abidjan. Et depuis, il a voulu, lui et certains de ses collègues, que nous nouions des rapports de collaboration et ça ne s'est jamais démenti. Nous avons échangé sur pas mal de choses. Il nous a soutenus même dans l'élaboration, dans la rédaction de décision de la Convention d'Abidjan sur la pollution plastique. Et nous sommes aussi en discussion avec eux, avec leur appui, sur le traité international légalement contraignant que le monde cherche à développer aujourd'hui pour lutter contre la pollution plastique, processus dans lequel, comme vous le savez, le WWF et d'autres partenaires comme la Fondation Ellen MacArthur travaillent bien et la Convention d'Abidjan, les régions sur ce point-là. Donc, c'est dire que nous sommes très heureux aujourd'hui d'avoir, en tout cas moi personnellement, d'avoir Prabhat ici aujourd'hui et je le remercie d'avoir accepté de venir partager son expérience très riche avec nous. Donc, sur ce, je cède la parole afin que Tony puisse faire la présentation de notre intervenant d'aujourd'hui.
Thank you, Abdullah. Thank you so much for the recap. We're going to hand over now to Dr. Tony Ribink, SST CEO, who will be introducing our speaker, Prabhat, today. Over to you, Tony.
Thank you very much. And as Abdullah has indicated, we're very fortunate to have Prabhat talking to us today. We've had excellent speakers throughout the series, and today is no exception. If one has a look at the advertisement regarding this meeting today, you will see that Prabhat is in fact a senior policy analyst on climate and plastics at WWF South Africa. And that's incredibly important because plastics is actually a major contributor to climate change as well. Prabhat is in fact Dr. Prabhat, of course, because he holds a PhD in environmental science and is an Alexander von Humboldt Fellow in climate protection with more than 15 years of experience in working on climate and policy issues. And that's really important because today we will be looking at policy responses. Throughout this series, we've been looking at best practice and the way forward regarding to best practice, and that is to pull it into a position where it can actually inform policy and change policy where policies do need to be changed. So we're deeply very grateful for Prabhat to be part of this today, because he actually draws on his deep understanding of a variety of national engagements, and he's had them with and on national policies and frameworks, and both in an advocacy role on the global side, and this was mentioned in passing by Abdullah in terms of developing international policies and basically international commitments. And he's working, of course, within the Abidjan Convention area as well, and therefore he is in fact very knowledgeable about what's happening in developing countries and how we should adapt to the global context. He works at the interface of policy research and policy advocacy for advancing institutional response to issues of pertinence to global environmental governance. Again, highly pertinent to what we are doing. In 2020, and this is a superb accolade, one of his co-authored works was selected amongst the top 20 papers over 20 years of publications in the Journal of Climate Policy. Well, congratulations on that. Certainly we're very privileged. And he's very keen to explore how we can simultaneously address climate and the plastics crisis. Well, Prabhat, thank you very, very much indeed for giving your time today to us. We look forward greatly to your talk. So over to you, and Tara will lead the way too.
Thank you, Anthony, for the generous introduction. I just want to check, Tara, is my audio clear?
Yes, we can hear you. Can you hear me, Prabhat?
Thank you very much. I'm just going to share the screen. And if you could just confirm if my screen is visible.
Yes, it's up and we can see it in full screen.
Tara, could you confirm if my screen is visible?
Yes, it's up and we can see it in full screen. Yes, Prabhat, can you hear me? It's up and it's visible? Okay.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon, colleagues. Thank you, Tony, for your generous introduction. I'm Prabhat Upadhyaya. I'm Senior Policy Analyst at WWF South Africa, based in Cape Town. And I would be sharing my views on global and regional responses to address plastic pollution. But before we go there, just to make sure that everybody is awake, we have a question for you, just to get a sense of where we are. Tara, do you mind? Yeah. If you could respond to this question on your screen, that on a scale from 1 being least important to 5, very important, how important do you think a global response to plastic pollution is? So most of us here think that a global response is very important. So I think my job is done. I can pack my bag and we can have an early evening. I'm just kidding. Thank you very much for your response. We can dive deep into why we need to have a global response. But before I start, maybe just a word on WWF. I'm sure some of you have seen the panda logo. WWF is one of the world's largest environmental NGOs. We have presence in a number of countries across the continents, and we work on a range of issues, working to conserve the biological diversity, working on issues of climate change at both international level, but also at the local level. So we not only work on variety of issues, but we also work across the scales. And an important part of any global environmental challenge is that we understand that it needs to be addressed at multiple levels. And when I say level, I mean you could have a global level, you could have a regional level, you could have a national level, but then you can also have local level. So for example, Abidjan Convention countries are regional, or Africa as a whole is a region, but then you also need action at both the global scale, but also at the local level. So today we will be talking about what Tony also referred to as international national dynamics, and what we do there. So just to give some, we all have been talking about plastic pollution, plastic waste issue, but I think in the last 2-3 years, there has been a growing realization that plastic pollution has reached a crisis level. 8 million tons of plastic waste enters our oceans annually, and it's anticipated that this number would increase by 4 times by 2050. Since 2000, the plastic industry has produced as much plastics as all the preceding year collectively. So it's, one can say that after 2000, there has been a sort of an explosion in how we use plastic in the various spheres of life. And I guess the reason why that has been the case is because plastic is cheap, it's versatile, and it's reliable. So these are important qualities which plastic has. But unfortunately, because of these qualities, it is very cheap to use and throw. And that has kind of fueled a culture where we do not think about what happens to plastic after it has been thrown away. And if you look at, the scale issue again, every minute one garbage truck of plastic enters the ocean. So by the time I would have finished this presentation, 30-40 of garbage truck would have entered, of plastics would have entered the ocean. So every minute is ticking, and every minute we are contributing to this huge problem. Another important fact to bear in mind is that this 3/4 of the plastic ever produced, that 75% of plastic ever produced, is already waste. So we need to think carefully on how we can address this issue, but not only in our local constituencies where we live, but also we need to think in terms of scale. There is now growing evidence that once the plastic goes into the ocean, it goes into the fish, and eventually it makes its way to our plates, and then to our bodies. So we are getting those studies which are indicating that we need to address it soon. In terms of biodiversity, its impact on biodiversity, 1 sea turtle out of 2 has ingested plastic. If you look at the seabirds, the exposure is even more intense, and this is sometimes we do see also, and it's not only in oceans, in other, for example, in India, you will find plastics in the stomach of cows, and sometimes you'll see them dying because they have ingested plastic, and they can't do anything about it. So it is also having an impact on living matter, so to say. I want to bring your attention to a tool which we have created. It's called Global Plastic Navigator. You can find it online, where we have tried to present how the plastic is traveling across the world. And we have different scales. So on this web page, I've just taken one image. It shows the floating plastic concentration across the world, in our oceans. So if you look at Asia, Southeast Asia, that's between India, Bangladesh, area, you'll see the violet color is quite intense. That means that the concentration is pretty high. Similarly, on west of Africa, of Australia, west of Namibia, and just above Latin America, you'll see that the concentration is pretty high. Similarly, north of Africa, the concentration is drastic. Similarly, if you look at the orange, so that's the ocean part. If you look at the land, if you look at the orange part, it pictures where is the mismanaged plastic waste. I think we have a limitation in this representation in the sense that it doesn't capture, I think it doesn't capture the plastic which is exported from developed countries, plastic waste which is exported from developed countries to developing countries. So that is a problem. But still, if you look at a number of countries, the plastic is not being managed. Plastic waste is not being managed. Then there is another, that how you will see the arrows which indicates that how the plastic is traveling. Sometimes it travels just in circles. So south of India, around Australia, west of South Africa, these gyros are created which increase the concentration of plastic. So it's useful to get a sense of that plastic waste is not just a plastic bag. There is a scale dimension of this challenge which we need to come to terms with. Similarly, this is another dimension that it shows the river basins where the plastic actually comes from land onto the ocean. So that's also a concern. The question becomes, how are we going to address it? Are we going to address it here, or we go up the value chain and start looking at where all we can address it? So there are a number of gaps and challenges. We have identified 5 key challenges. The first one being that there is no global rules. There's no standards, there are no recommendations or guideposts on what we need to do, what we do not need to do, kind of things. So there are different conventions which address different dimensions of plastic value chain. So Basel Convention, for example, now addresses the export-import of plastic waste, but we do not have one single stop where we, as a reference point, which says that this is what you need to do on plastic, what you don't need to do on plastic. And because of these lack of global rules, lack of global goals, there is no clear direction on where we want to go from where we are today. As a result, there is lack of coordination, there's lack of accountability. A follow-up on lack of these systems is then that there is hardly any reporting to a common reference point. When we do not have reporting, then we can't pinpoint on how big the problem is and where the problem is more, where it's increasing, where it's coming under control. So the monitoring and review mechanisms are not there. On climate change, you have something like Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which has come up with a very hard-hitting report in last few years, which has changed the discourse, changed the narrative on the climate problem. So now, as we are talking today on 22nd of April, which is the Earth Day, coincidentally, President Biden is organizing a climate summit where he's going to announce, and he has invited 40 other countries to come together to announce key actions. Right. But the momentum was shifted through 2 mechanisms, through IPCC report, but also through the Paris Agreement and the UNFCCC. Both of those are missing when it comes to plastic. And then even if we were to have all these agreements, we do not have a financial mechanism for supporting different countries in their efforts to address plastic pollution. So that's at the global scale. Then nationally also, we have significant gaps at national and regional legislation and commitment level. So the policy landscape is very patchy, if I can use that word. So there is a need for a treaty on plastic pollution. Now, if you again look at why can't we take other approaches? So why can't we take on voluntary approaches? Why can't, that kind of question often comes. The problem with voluntary approaches, voluntary initiatives, is again the issue of scale. They aim to address uh, a company, interventions in a company rather than at industry. And maybe there are interventions which are aimed at a whole industry, but we have so many industries. So the voluntary initiatives cannot provide a huge scale which is needed to address this issue. Although there are initiatives and they provide us experience on which we can build on. Then the regulations are misaligned. 2/3 of countries with plastic legislation only regulate plastic bags. So sometimes, especially in African countries, we have banned plastic bags, but that is a symptom. There are it's not that other parts of plastic waste are being addressed. So we need to think a bit holistically in how do we address that and not just focus on the symptoms. So some of you know about the fire in Cape Town. So right now the approach is that we are going for firefighting. We are not questioning what are the causes of that fire so that we can proactively start addressing the causes of those fires. Then we need specific targeted interventions also, especially to address leakages across the geographies. And therein different countries have different capacities. So to harmonize that, to bring different countries, enhance their capacities, we need to come together in different, to appreciate different national circumstances. And finally, the reporting capabilities are essentially lacking. Very few countries report what's happening to their plastic waste. Also, there is differences in what we understand when we say something like plastic waste. So there's no common definition. Although efforts are being undertaken to define things, but I think it's important that we are on a common, platform from where we know that we are talking about the same things. So these are some major issues which call for a treaty or a global agreement approach to address plastic pollution. Now, the question becomes, even if there was a legally binding agreement, let's say, what would it provide? What new elements can it do? So one can look at the climate negotiations. Initially, it had Kyoto Protocol, where developed countries were given target. Now we are in a Paris world, so to say, where countries come up with their targets, but everybody is striving to aim towards 1.5 C, 2 degrees Celsius world by 2050. Similar, so that's a global goal, roughly, the direction in which we are going towards. So an international legally binding agreement, and I'm gonna use terms like international legally binding or global agreement. What I'm suggesting is a global response. These are different way of expressing the response. It can be legal, it need not be legal, but what we essentially want is a global response. So what it would provide is a global goal. It would also incentivize setting national targets and ensuring that these are implemented through national action plans. So that's one. There would be a global architecture to coordinate, report, and review. Something, again, I think we would have to look at how different existing global architecture to deal with different environmental problems operate. But a quick reference point to Paris, it has a feature called global stock take. So every 5 years, countries will take stock of where they are and what needs to be done. And if they are far behind, then they need to ramp up their efforts. So that kind of architecture would help to say what our target is and where we want to, how fast we need to approach. So if you, and then it can provide access to an intergovernmental. When I say intergovernmental, it means a panel which is comprised of experts from different countries or different governments who nominate their experts. So an intergovernmental panel of experts and who can set up common agreed upon means to measure and monitor the extent of the challenge and on an ongoing basis. Then we need global standards and regulations on what are the high risk materials and what can be done to dispose them in a responsible manner. And finally, again, the implementation support mechanism, especially in developing countries, and even there also, especially in African or say small island developing countries, they need access to finance, they need access to technology, they need access to capacity building and expertise to be able to address this problem in their own constituency, but also create pressure on developed countries to own up their responsibility of this challenge. So it could provide various elements for us to tackle this problem. Then if you look at, let's say if the overarching objective of a global agreement is something along the lines of that we would eliminate plastic leakage into the oceans by 2040. So initially when we started in WWF, we were focused very much on marine plastic pollution, but now we have changed it from marine to focus on the plastic pollution. So taking into account landlocked countries, I think there are 17, 18 landlocked countries in Africa that we factor them also into the account. But if, let's say, the overarching objective was to eliminate plastic leakage into ocean by 2040, then a global agreement could provide 4 key components. First would be clarity on definitions. We would know that when we refer to a technical term, it means something specific and not, it doesn't get lost in translation. We will have consistent standards and those can be applied across the value chain. So for example, EMF has Ellen MacArthur Foundation has something along the lines of global commitment definitions, which could serve as a reference point. Second would be policies. What kind of response measures, what kind of policies and what kind of framework can be utilized to address this issue? Again, it speaks to coordination, and it's an often repeated point, coordination, but it seems very simple, but in effect, it's very difficult. And just to give a sense of how difficult it is, if we try to set up a Zoom call for tomorrow afternoon amongst everybody present in the meeting today, I can bet that we won't be able to find time for tomorrow because everybody has their own priorities. Now imagine that at a much bigger scale, and that's where coordination becomes important. So we need coordination, and that could be provided by that. National targets needed to deliver at a global scale. So here, World Economic Forum has global and national plastics action plan that could provide some inputs. Reporting, as I've highlighted, to provide common reporting and monitoring standards at both. So this is important. This is not only at the government or national level, but also for the companies. So we need to address both sides of things. And as I mentioned in the previous slide, establishing an intergovernmental scientific review panel. Here, some examples are what's been proposed by Jambeck et al., but also what we have been doing. WWF has been working with EMF on setting up plastics pact. We've done that in South Africa, currently working to set it up in Kenya, but that's also in other countries, wherein we bring companies together to look at plastic and see how we can address it. Finally, on implementation support, I think we have said a lot on that, but essentially to fund the waste management capabilities, ensure access to technologies, and so that we are not, we have the best technologies available. Also to spread awareness about the issue, look at the new evidence and build capacity on the ground, and also to fund innovation, to explore breakthrough technologies, to find innovative solutions to address this challenge. And many countries are making funding available, but I think like any other challenge, it needs to scale up much over and beyond what's currently available. I'm not going to go deep into this slide. It has a lot of information, but maybe just if you look at first vertically and then horizontally. So vertically in column 1, it shows the gaps we have right now in terms of knowledge. So the horizontal line, gaps in terms of resources and gaps in terms of law or rules. And then the next columns correspondingly talk about what's the action required and what could be the potential treaty element which speaks to these gaps. So if you look at the knowledge, we have two kind of knowledge gaps. One is in terms of understanding the problem, how big the problem is, and the second in terms of what response we need to come up with to address that problem. In terms of the problem, we could come up with a dedicated scientific body, so that's where it fits in. So the scientific body which I've been talking about, that can respond to that particular gap, it serves that gap. Similarly, monitoring and review system could help in sharpening our response, because then it will provide information that where we are succeeding, which efforts are faltering, and where we need to sharpen our efforts. In terms of resources, financial, technical, know-how, different kind of resources, the implementation part and supporting implementation would be an important element of such an architecture. So we would need a policy toolkit which says, these kind of policies work in certain conditions, whereas in other conditions, different kind of policies would work. So something which may work in, say, Europe may not work in Africa, but something which would work in Africa, whether that will work in a country in East Asia or not. So that could be, this could help that. And then a dedicated financial mechanism, I think that's very important. Similarly, program of training and support for research, experiment, and innovation. So those gaps. And finally, in terms of the rule, we need, the big gap is that there's no globally applicable rules, and the treaty or global agreement can help define the minimum standards that everybody needs to stick to, and countries can go over and beyond that. But so this is quite a dense slide, but it tries to provide you a sense of where we are lacking and how, if you go for a global response, which elements will speak to which gaps we have. If you have any questions, you can put it on the chat. We can take it after the presentation on this slide. But yeah. Again, there is a global recognition of the problem. So the plastic pollution dimension is discussed or negotiated under the aegis of United Nations Environment Program or Assembly. So this is from 2018. The ad hoc open-ended expert group was set up to look at combating marine plastic litter and microplastic. And this was through the UNEA Resolution 3.7, which stressed the importance of long-term elimination of discharge of litter and microplastic to oceans, and of avoiding detriment to marine ecosystem and human activity. So it's very much focused on the marine environment. But if you look at the SDG 14.1, it speaks to that also, because it says that by 2025, prevent and significantly reduce marine pollution of all kinds, in particular from land-based activities. So there is it's a recognition that marine pollution doesn't arise in marine environment, but it has linkage with what happens on the land. So it has to be looked in the broader scheme of things, and then addressed on the land as well. So, but then the question becomes, a global agreement is fine, but where are we now? So are we getting our act together? So this is a map of what has been happening in last couple of years. There was a statement from different regional groups. For example, Nordic Council of Ministers came up with a statement. Pacific Islands Forum Secretariat, Caribbean Community. These were the first groups who made a public call for new global agreement through their regional declaration. This was in, I think, early 2019. Then in November 2019, in the African Ministerial Conference on the Environment held in Durban, African countries came together and had a joint declaration on including on plastic pollution. We'll come to that. The Government of India in January 2020 called for a global agreement to be explored. And March 2020, EU Commission decided to work for a new global agreement on plastic pollution. So this was as COVID started hitting on our shores. And so I think after that, the momentum has slowed down a bit, but there are different mechanisms being explored. One of them is, so the commitment of these countries remain, but because of difficulty in meeting in person, it's become a bit tricky. But the group, so in the United Nations headquarters in New York, a group of friends to combat marine plastic pollution. When I say group of friends, it's referring to countries, group of countries, with 55 founding members was created. So essentially, there is a growing wave of support for global action, which is gathering pace and momentum. But let's go slightly deeper into what Emson said in 2019. So this is on your left is the text from Emson 17/9 appendix paragraph 8 on plastic pollution. This is a single line or paragraph, however you want to look at it. I've tried to break it down so that it's easier to read. But if you look at different elements, in the first line, it's saying that African countries are committing themselves to support global action to address plastic pollution. Then the second point, they're emphasizing that it needs work to engage more effectively on the global governance dimension. And the third point, it keeps open the option for either looking at the existing agreement or looking at a new global agreement on plastic pollution, which takes a comprehensive approach to look at both production and consumption and waste management. So African countries as of now are open to both options, but it has to ensure that there is coherence. And here, existing regional and international instruments, I think Abidjan Convention can play a role here, that it has to be in coherence with the activities being undertaken here. And also taking into consideration the national circumstances, we can't expect African countries to be taking on action at the scale of developed countries, but they also need to be supported. So you will see that while African countries agreed to look at options, they also built in safeguards in this statement, so that it's not just so that we can't just assume that you tick mark a box and say now you do it by yourself. So, but it's an important development because it indicates that African countries are open to take this approach. In 2020, in the 8th special session held online virtually in December, this disposition was reaffirmed by all African countries. So that's another important point. But as I mentioned, there is an ad hoc expert group on marine litter. So African countries have made submission to that group. On the right, you will see the first page of the submission, which provides the context and the purpose. I think it's important to just go through the purpose. It develops the views of the African group regarding possible global response options. And these, so in terms of the possible global response options, on the left, you will see the possible treaty elements which were suggested by the African group of negotiators. So first is the shared vision, provide reduction targets which are clear, measurable, and timely, incentivize national action plans which are contextualized to the national circumstance, ensure accountability by means of monitoring and reporting, set up a scientific body to provide state-of-the-art knowledge, provide support for implementation, and agree on common rules and regulations. So that's a key element for a global architecture. And then there are suggestions for national or local responses in terms of the regulatory governance measures, how it's going to be operationalized, but also importantly, raising awareness at the local level. that, so we can't just address plastic pollution at one part of the overall chain. We have to address across the value chain, starting from production all the way to consumption and then disposal. Yeah, I will again go back to the Global Plastic Navigator. So this slide, I am not a big, my apologies for this map. We are working on fixing it. It's not an equal area map, so it gives a much more weightage to the countries in, or side to the countries in the Northern Hemisphere. So Greenland looks bigger than Africa. We are working to fix it, but what it indicates is which countries have supported a global agreement. So the dark green countries are the countries which are explicitly supporting a new global agreement, whereas the countries in light green, they have indicated that they're open to a new global agreement. So all the African countries, but also a couple of African countries like Ghana, Kenya, which are more clear, which are more forthcoming in terms of a new agreement. So it provides you an overview of that. I think a couple of countries, so this is from some time ago, some countries may have changed their position. There might be some new countries which have started taking more stronger position, some countries which have stepped back, but African countries as a group have maintained a certain level of support, which is encouraging. So let me see if I can go next. So that's from the country national perspective, but there are other, but an argument for a UN treaty is also supported by academics. So on your left are the studies which emphasize why we need a global agreement. Then the civil society, so report by WWF, CL, EIA, IUCN, different civil society organizations, that why we need a global agreement. As I mentioned, governments also indicating that. But then also, and this is quite important, that the business and business groups are also calling for a UN treaty on plastic pollution. So if you look at a number of companies here, you will find Pick n Pay has supported this call. Woolworths Holding Limited, Woolworth is part of it, has supported it, and so these are the two African or South African companies, but then also various global companies: Pepsi, Coca-Cola, Biostoff, P&G, Unilever. So they have also supported that we need a global agreement. So maybe just briefly, if I can just say a word or two on why they think this is important. So for this report, we reached out to various businesses. This is a report by WWF, Ellen MacArthur Foundation, and BCG on the business case for a UN treaty on plastic pollution. This is a summary of the report on 4 main reasons why a treaty is important. And we have categorized it in 3 ways that, there are various challenges. The UN treaty could help to overcome those barriers, and how it benefits business. Some of these I have covered. The voluntary initiatives lacking sufficient scale, regulations not covering the entire value chain, lack of basic data, and significant market capability gaps. And a UN treaty can address these by providing harmonized regulatory standard, clear targets and setting up direction, providing common reporting guidelines, which is useful then to compare the performance of different companies and different countries with each other, and also across space, across time. So that's where the common reporting matrices hold their strength. And then ensuring that the investment goes to ensure circularity of the plastic to ramp it up. It can benefit business by reducing complexity, enhancing waste management condition. It can give them a stabilized policy environment, a long-term policy environment, according to which the business can adapt and not be worried about that there will be change in the policy environment. So, a number of benefits for businesses there. And this is the text of the business call for a UN treaty. I think I would spend some time on the last paragraph where it emphasized the imperative in working together to solve this problem and urging the member states of the United Nations to urgently start negotiations on a treaty for plastic pollution. So it's once we agree, I think what right now what we are trying to do, countries are trying to do, is agree that we need to start negotiations. Once that starts, then we can decide on what would be the nature of that treaty. But right now, the focus is that countries need to agree that we need a global response. And I think that's where studies like this are important, because they present that business is ready to move. And if not that, they are against this whole process. So to sum it up, the world needs a new binding global agreement and adoption of a negotiating mandate at UNEA 5 in February would be the first step towards it. Once we have that, then we can go into the nitty-gritty of how an agreement would look like. This will take time, but I think it's important that it sends a signal to all the members that this is the direction we are taking. And then you will see a lot of winners and losers, those who start adopting already and those who will not. So in summary, what we need to achieve a UN treaty, first and foremost, we need more countries on board. In the image which I showed to you of countries, 69 countries have indicated that they are supporting a new agreement, whereas 65 countries are open to new agreement. So it's almost 130 countries which are open to this idea that we need a global agreement. We need to further increase their numbers. For that, we need high political commitment at the high political level from the leadership in the countries. And then we need to start exploring the necessary elements of a treaty. And that's important from an African perspective, because we do not want to be caught in a position where a treaty is designed in a way to favor certain countries and our concerns are kept aside. So it's important to start exploring that already at this stage. And here the Abidjan Convention and similarly Nairobi Convention have an important role to play in surfacing those concerns, but also echoing or providing a strong signal to other African countries that the members of Abidjan Convention are ready to take a stronger position than all other African countries. So a ministerial declaration at the COP or something to that effect would send a stronger signal that this thing needs to be happening right now already. So that's the overall end of my presentation. If you have any questions, you're most welcome to send me an email, or my colleague, I think, who is also in the audience, Moloko Matipa, who is the regional coordinator working on plastic policy, and he's based in WWF South Africa. He has a sharp overview of what's happening in different countries in Africa, and is working closely with various offices in influencing the position. So more than happy to take any questions now, and thank you for your time. Back to you, Tony and Tara.
Thank you so much, Prabhat. That was wonderful. We have already had a few questions come through in the chat box and in the Q&A box. Prabhat, I just want to check, can you hear me? I'm not sure if you're in the English room or...
Tara, can you hear me?
Hi, Prabhat. Sorry, I wasn't in the English room. Thank you so much for your presentation. That was great. We have had some questions come through already in the Q&A box and the chat. The first question that we have here says, how do we get countries to domesticate the Global Plastics Treaty if it comes to effect in the context of some countries not doing that with the already signed treaties?
Yeah, so I think this is a big problem with any environmental governance architecture or any international governance architecture, that they do not have teeth because countries have their own sovereignty, right? And that is a challenge which has to be dealt with, which you can't really deal with using a stick approach. You have to create norms in the sense that, what is acceptable behavior, what is not acceptable behavior, and it takes time. So the domestication of the not only Global Plastic Treaty or any other treaty, it is a gradual process. But what helps is if there's a momentum, in the sense, I mean, we have been discussing on or negotiating on climate change for, I think, 25, if not 30 years now. But now, if you speak to someone that, okay, we want to set up a new coal power plant in any given country, it will be so much harder to get new finance for that now than say 10 years ago. So it takes time. It takes time. You can name and shame countries, but I guess countries try not to do that because you do not want to push countries around, um, because there are different national circumstances. But at the same time, you have to create pressure by means of advocacy, highlighting that which countries are actually moving. And that's what we have also tried to do in our approach. We highlight those countries which are taking a positive stand, and emphasize what they are doing right. So you try to change the narrative gradually. And in the context of countries not doing the same, yeah, so there are fundamental problems with the UN architecture, in the sense the UN has limitation in how much it can enforce. So unfortunately, we have to operate within that structure. But as the evidence is mounting, the pressure on countries to act is growing. So I think we have to continue creating that pressure, and ensure that investments and financial flows go in the direction which are in line with the future, which works for everybody and not for just a select few.
Thank you, Prabhat.
Sarah, next question.
The next question says, this idea of a global agreement is important and good, as is the momentum. As is the momentum it is having across regions. However, just like the Paris Accord, a binding global agreement is hard to imagine, and countries are notorious for falling short of targets made. What is the likelihood of a binding plastics global agreement? The elephant in the room is also the low price of oil. Without the shifting, it's hard to imagine a real impact on the problem. Can a global treaty put pressure on this?
So I think the plastic. So I started working on plastic 2-3 years ago, and before that I was not as aware, or actually I was not aware of its linkage with climate or its linkage with oil. So it's interesting that how the narrative is changing, and there are efforts now to see that how plastic is linked with climate issue, and there in the oil industry how it's also looking at plastic as a area of growth for itself. And oil industry is notorious in spreading disinformation, etc. So yes, so this is the likelihood of a binding plastic global agreement. I think it depends. It varies. It's not a especially, and I think I share your frustration in the sense that it's not an easy answer to say yes, it's yes or no. You have to live with the nuances that in some countries they will follow this agreement, others may not follow this agreement. In US, one day you may have Trump, another day you may have Biden, and you have to deal with that. But then the point is you need to identify a few group of countries which can maintain a certain level of pace, so that as and when other countries come up, the pace increases. And so it's a complex question. It's a complex question, and it all depends on how much we are willing to look at the alternatives into the plastic, or if not alternative, how best to utilize the plastic so that it's not seen as a cheap resource which you can use and throw, but how best you can build in the circular dimensions, circular economy dimensions, so that we value plastic as a resource. Yeah. I'm not sure if my apologies, there's no right and wrong answer to these. So I'm just thinking as I'm looking at your question, but I hope it answered a bit. Thanks.
Thank you, Prabhat. It's good to get your opinion on that. And as you say, there isn't really a clear-cut answer. There's another question in the chat that says, in climate in climate policies and plans, there are uniform ways of measuring the changing elements, including greenhouse gas emissions. There are no uniform measurements for plastic waste. How do you suggest that challenge is solved?
Yeah, so a couple of my colleagues have been arguing that we need a scientific body which defines these standards. So these, even in climate policies and plans, these standards or uniform ways were not pre-existing. These were defined and have been refined over time. So similarly, we would need to get moving on these and identify, different categories. And there are many ways to slice and dice this thing. We can start so one simple explanation is, you can look at plastic bags, but other kind of plastic, you can look at the size of the plastic, you can look at the content or type of the plastic. So there are different ways, and I think the point is that if we do not start talking about it, we will not find out the solutions, and that's where this conversation need to take a global space, because this is not a problem which, say, South Africa or any other African country can solve on its own. It needs a global conversation to bring everybody together, that we need to address it and how best to make it work. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Prabhat. There's a comment here that says, thank you for the brilliant and rich presentation. At the regional level, what type of legal framework could the Abidjan Convention region adopt to fight against plastic pollution? And to what extent could the WWF help?
Thanks, Abdullah. I think, yes, so the legal frameworks, I'm not as familiar with the working of Abidjan Convention, but through the AMSN declaration, we have a certain level of agreement amongst all countries. What Abidjan Convention can do is, if you have discussions within the Abidjan countries members and say, how can we go beyond this thing? What is it? What elements we can agree on? And that can help sort of set up a race to the top. So the legal framework, you could define that we could have a legal agreement at the regional level, or you could say regionally, these countries, we agree that we need a global agreement, or so you can weigh down on one side of the options. So there we would need to discuss with you in terms of to what extent WWF can help. We can provide you with the research we have been doing. We can provide you inputs on what's happening in different regions in the world, and also provide you, if need be, work with you behind the screens, because I think that's important also. A lot of the negotiations which you see doesn't happen in front of your eyes, but you need to engage with different organizations, you need to engage with different countries to see what they are willing to support, so right now there's discussion going on to come up with a statement or resolution in the UNEA. So already the preparations are ongoing. So we can help you by providing some information to that extent and put you in touch with colleagues, but also support the activities of the Abidjan Convention in general, on specific activities on plastic pollution. Thanks.
Tara, excuse me to jump in, and sorry, Prabhat, I have missed the first part of your answers to the first part of the question because I was struggling to fix a problem with the translation. So, le traducteur, l'interprète, si vous m'entendez, tout ce que vous dites en français, on ne le reçoit pas. Donc, vérifiez avec votre micro ce qui se passe parce que il y a un bruit insupportable et les francophones n'entendent absolument rien du tout à ce que vous dites en français. So sorry, Prabhat, but thank you. We will discuss it out of here maybe. So, thank you, Tara.
Thank you, Abdullah.
I think we can go ahead with the next question, and then we can review your previous answer, Prabhat, at a later stage. For now, I think let's move on to the next question, that says, are there any plans to regulate polymer prices to keep recycling financially sustainable?
Thanks, Stephanie. I won't be able to answer that question. Again, I think polymer prices, it will depend very much on the market, but I think there are other interventions which countries need, are, I guess in their different national contexts, are looking at to ensure that recycling is financially sustainable. But then again, the question becomes, it might be financially sustainable in one country, but not in 10 countries. And if so, the scale of the challenge still remains. So this is again something that could be discussed at a global level, that, you know, but also once you have such an agreement, it puts pressure on the oil industry to get its act together. Ideally, you do not want plastic or polymers that their prices are cheap, because if they are cheap, you know, it will not be valued and it will continue moving on use and throw model. So I think this is an important part. How that needs to be done. Right now, it varies from countries to countries, but at a global scale, I'm not aware if it's being done at the moment. Thanks.
Thank you, Prabhat. Can you comment at all about, I know you mentioned that there are research sections of the WWF that are looking at the baselines and things like that that would be needed. Is any research being done, to your knowledge, about the impacts of plastic pollution on climate change and greenhouse gas emissions, as well as the plastic alternatives?
So there have been a couple of papers published, especially I think this is 2.5 years ago. There was a paper published in Nature, the journal Nature Climate Change. I can send the link to you, Tara, which looked at the linkage between the climate and the plastic challenge. The conversation is ongoing. As you're aware, climate change is a much bigger issue, but the linkage with plastic is being driven by organizations which are working on plastic issues. So I think CIEL has come up with a study looking at the linkages, and there is a growing recognition that, you know, that as there is more pressure on fossil fuel industries, on oil industries, as we are moving away from, say, moving towards battery operated cars, electric cars, the oil industry is looking at different avenues, particularly plastic, to maintain its financial viability. And I think that's a recognition which is growing. And so that linkage is being explored increasingly, that how do we make sure that while we are addressing climate change, we do not end up overlooking plastic and fueling plastic production, which can create an immediate challenge for us. So that's there. Tara, maybe I can just also respond to a question by Chandani on what are the areas where research is needed in this field. So Chandani, when it comes to research, it very much depends on where it's a blank slate. You can look at wherever. So for example, ILO has recently, I think last year, published a report. Not ILO, my apologies. Not ILO, I think there was a report which was looking at the crime. Interpol has looked at the crime dimension, or the illegal trade of plastic waste, and how it's fueling crime. So that is something which I don't think I could have ever thought of. That's so far away. But, you know, because there is growing regulation on how plastic needs to be exported or imported, some countries are letting the plastic, letting the illegal elements or illegal dimension of trade dictating how it can be used. So the plastic waste is being used by these illegal organizations to generate revenue. So it depends. So there could be technical sides. You could look at emphasizing the linkage between plastic and climate problem. You can focus on how can we use plastic more effectively so that it ensures that we are achieving other SDGs also. If you look at the COVID crisis now, I think we are realizing that plastic is important in ensuring safety, security of, just in the short term. But then the question becomes how are we going to ensure that in the process we are not creating another crisis? So there are a lot of research areas. It's very much from which perspective you come. You can also, for me, one major issue is implementation. The countries agree on, internationally, they can make national policies, but when it comes to actual implementation on the ground, that's always a problem. So how are you going to ensure on something like plastic? So plastic is not like, say, managing transport, wherein even though it's complicated, but in a city you may have, say, 500,000 vehicles, and the question would be, let's regulate 500,000 vehicles and their emissions. On plastic, you may have 5 million n number of plastics, so how are you going to address that? You can't have standards for each and every chocolate and each and every eclairs in that sense. So you need to think about those things. So there are a lot of areas, I'm sure, depending on which line you take, you can delve deeper into them.
Thank you, Prabhat.
Thanks, Tara.
That's very interesting. I would never have considered the illegal trade of plastic waste. Do you know, just to follow on from that, I don't know if you know if Interpol was sort of consulting with the Basel Convention in those instances or not?
I'm not sure, but I can just, if you give me a moment, I can look at the study which was there. I'll have to just quickly search for Interpol on my laptop.
Sorry, Prabhat. It's not urgent. I just wondered if you could comment on that. There was another comment in the Q&A box that says from Chandru that says some countries are looking to introduce taxes on virgin plastics to incentivize the larger use of recycled plastic. I don't know if you want to comment on that at all in terms of plastic sustainability and EPR.
Sorry. So maybe I missed it. Hi, Chandru. Good to see you here. Introduce taxes on virgin. I think maybe Chandru is responding to a query, the previous query, if I'm correct.
Yes, I don't know if you want to comment.
By Stephanie.
Okay.
No, I think this is very much similar to the carbon tax discussion that that we need to. We are gradually moving into a space where we are running out of win-win options. We are getting into space where we need to make hard choices. If you look at COVID, that is an example that we all, whether we go for lockdown or not, that's a hard choice. But that's where you need to consider the trade-offs in terms of and synergies. So trade-offs are competing objectives, and synergies are objectives which are aligned. And therein you need to figure out whether this option of introducing tax on virgin plastics, which from my perspective makes absolute sense, whether that's feasible, whether that's necessary or not. So I think, again, on a national context, this needs to be factored in. I'm just going to share my screen to just highlight this report from 2018. It's by Interpol Strategic Analysis Report, Emerging Criminal Trends in the Global Plastic Waste Market since January 2018. It doesn't speak much about African context right now. This is a much bigger issue in Southeast Asia, East Asia. But as these countries are ramping up efforts to tackle this issue, the illegal trade has a nature that it tries to identify new avenues where it can move. So for them, it could be easier to move to African countries and shift the operation there. So just wanted to bring this to attention. Thanks.
Thank you, Prabhat. There's been another comment here in the chat that says, regarding the mobilization of private companies, some voices question the sincerity of this commitment when these companies are among the polluters and suspect greenwashing. What do you think about it? And what can these companies concretely do to stop their polluting activities?
Yeah, so this is again something which is not unique to plastics. Even in climate, if you look at ExxonMobil, so again, I think ExxonMobil, if you whether you look from climate perspective or plastic perspective, all roads will lead to ExxonMobil and the likes. So there are some companies which, you know, which take commitments for sake of it, which look at this problem as a problem of just a case of green marketing or packaging or just addressing at the surface, whereas there are other companies which are actually looking at addressing it to the core. So just I think beginning of this month, Dove has made an announcement that it's you know, those what do you call them, the bottles for to stop odor. They have moved away from plastic to aluminum bottles. So you know, you can just change the filling, so it reduces the consumption of plastic. Similarly, just last week, noticed that there are, instead of shampoo bottles, companies are coming up with shampoo bars and conditioner bars, which essentially, if you look at why do we need bottles, we need bottles to ensure that the liquid consumption, whether it's Coca-Cola, whether it's shampoo, that liquid consumption is made visible. But the moment you convert liquid into solid, then you do not need plastic, right? But that's where innovation comes in. And so for me, I was thinking about this thing, so it was very encouraging to see that some companies are starting to come up with these new models, because that indicates that they are not just talking, they are actively looking at solutions to look at alternatives, either firstly trying to see whether plastic can be recycled or not in a more efficient manner. And if that cannot be done, then they're taking a step further. They're looking at actually fundamentally changing the product itself so that you do not need to use that plastic. So I think I wouldn't, I mean, there are certain companies, if it's a coal company, if it's an oil company, that is in their nature, they would want to push this thing. But there are other companies which can take measures to reduce the demand for these things. And I think that will gradually but surely impact the market.
Thank you, Prabhat. There's a follow-up question that says, do you have advocacy materials to convince member countries of the Abidjan Convention to become more involved in the adoption of this global treaty against plastic pollution?
Definitely. We have a lot of material. It will, I think we would need to have a conversation again with you, Abdullah, to just understand what kind of material you are looking at. Some of the material we already have, other we are gearing up to produce. So we are starting to look to produce an economic case for circular economy in the region. We are so it depends. So if you have any specific needs, you can also let me know, and we can think of developing those material also. But happy to share the existing material with you. And yeah, we as a network are working with different organizations to look at this problem from different angles. So for example, this Interpol study is fantastic in the sense that it's something which you wouldn't think that that the problem has reached to that extent, that this has become a viable option for the criminal elements. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Prabhat. I think you're right. I think it's a very unexpected result. That I don't see any more questions in the Q&A box or in the chat. But if anyone does have any future questions or comments, if you forward those on to us, we can happily pass those along to Prabhat. Otherwise, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us this afternoon, and for all the wonderful questions and insightful comments that have come through. We will be having another session next week, Thursday, but none next week, Tuesday. So that'll be the 29th of April. But for those of you who have registered, you should receive an email notifying you of that. We'll be hearing from Ibrahima, from the Abidjan region, who will be giving us a bit more insight there. Otherwise, Prabhat, thank you so much. I don't know if you have any more comments that you want to share with us before we end the session for today. Any parting words?
No, I think this was exciting. Also, to get these questions, it's always useful to to start thinking about these things from different perspective. But this is, I think, just to add, we have entered now a decade of action on environmental issues. So I think working in an environment space is not for faint-hearted. It's you come across some very sad news every once in a while, but I think I'm very looking forward to the next 5 years because there's a lot of action that's going to happen. And I would, just say that I think for me, I take strength when I look at these innovations in our daily lives. When companies move away from plastic bottles to bar, when say restaurants move away from certain things to becoming more responsible. I think as much as because of COVID and other things, our lives are becoming quite depressed. I would encourage everybody to be on a lookout for these things and draw strength from these interventions, because at the end of the day we need new ideas and we can use them to further scale up the various interventions. Thanks, Tara. That's from my side.
Thank you, Prabhat. I think a certain level of optimism is always good in the environmental field. Thank you so much. On behalf of SST and the Abidjan Convention, it was really wonderful to hear from you today and to hear your responses to all these questions. We really appreciate what you had to share with us today. I'm not sure if anyone else would like to make any comments before we close off for the session. If there's nothing from Tony or Abdullah, then Tony, I see you've unmuted. Is there something you'd like to say?
But just thank you very much indeed. That is superb. And what is particularly good is the way in which you tied together so many of the previous talks that we've had. So in a way, this is a unifying type of presentation and giving a new direction to some of the thoughts that we have on national regional action plans. And I think that they have to include being part of an international policy. And so thank you very much. Superbly given, as we would expect, but greatly appreciated from certainly ourselves. And I think looking at the way Abdullah got so engaged in questions, I'm sure he feels the same way. So from me, certainly, and representing SST, thank you very much indeed. And I'm sure representing all of those who attended.
Thank you. Thank you, Tony. Thank you, Prabhat. Ça a été une excellente présentation.
This has been an outstanding, stellar presentation performance. In terms of your presentation,
merci
once more,
pour le travail que tu fais, Prabhat, en matière de lutte contre la pollution plastique. Nous voyons très clairement maintenant que nous pouvons compter sur la collaboration avec des structures comme la vôtre qui travaillent au niveau international pour que ce traité dont nous parlons depuis un certain nombre d'années puisse embarquer les pays de la Convention d'Abidjan, que nous ne soyons pas aussi à la traite. Merci pour tout et nous comptons aussi sur votre apport pour le cadre régional que nous allons avoir à développer dans la région de la Convention d'Abidjan au nom de nos partenaires financiers.
Thank you, Abdullah and Tony, and thank you again, Prabhat. There've been quite a few comments coming through here that say thank you very much, really excellent. Thank you so much. So I think we can end the session here for today. Again, thank you everyone for joining, and a special thank you, Prabhat, for the very wonderful presentation. And we hope to see you all again on Thursday, the 29th of April at the same time.